The betrayal didn't arrive with gunfire. It arrived quietly, folded into a conversation, carried by a man who knew every door Bumpy Johnson had ever walked through. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't lie. He simply handed the Mafia a list of addresses, properties, safe houses, each one precise enough to look undeniable. In the underworld, information like that was worth more than bullets, because it promised something rarer than violence: certainty. If you knew where a man slept, where he stored his money, where he felt safe, you believed you owned his future. For the Mafia, this was the perfect kind of betrayal. No noise, no witnesses, no risk. Just a map and the confidence that Harlem's most untouchable figure had finally been cornered. Every address lined up, every move checked out. It looked clean, professional, final. And that's what made it dangerous, not just for Bumpy, but for the men who thought they were about to end him. Because Bumpy Johnson understood something most of his enemies never did. Power doesn't come from controlling territory. It comes from controlling belief. If you can make your opponent trust the wrong piece of information, you don't need to fight them at all. You let them move themselves into failure. As the plan rolled forward, crews prepared to hit every location at once. No escape routes, no room to maneuver. On paper, it was flawless, yet buried inside that perfect map was a single flaw so small it went unnoticed. One house that looked like every other, except for one detail no one questioned until it was too late. When the doors finally opened and the dust settled, the Mafia realized the truth in the most unsettling way possible. They had been given everything they asked for, and still, the most important place of all was empty. The man who betrayed Bumpy Johnson wasn't a stranger, and that was what made him valuable. He wasn't some desperate outsider fishing for protection. He was someone who had been close enough to see patterns, habits, and routines, close enough to know which addresses mattered and which ones were just noise. That proximity gave him credibility, and in the world of organized crime, credibility is a currency more powerful than loyalty. He didn't come to the Mafia empty-handed. He came prepared, calm, and precise. Every address he provided could be verified. Every location matched something real. Some were houses Bumpy had owned for years. Others were places he had used briefly and quietly. The list felt authentic because it was authentic. That was the brilliance of the betrayal. He didn't invent information. He curated it. He sold a version of the truth that looked complete, airtight, and devastating. The Mafia understood immediately what they were being offered. This wasn't a tip, it was a framework. With enough verified addresses, they could reconstruct Bumpy's entire operational footprint. Money storage, meeting spots, fallback locations, pressure points. It was the kind of intelligence they normally had to extract over years, now delivered in a single transaction. No shootouts, no exposure, just leverage. What the Snitch didn't realize, or chose to ignore, was that information ages the moment it leaves the owner's hands. Bumpy Johnson wasn't static. He adjusted constantly, shifting importance from one location to another, letting some houses become visible while others faded into irrelevance. But the Snitch assumed proximity meant permanence. He believed that once you had been trusted, the map stayed the same. From the Mafia's perspective, the betrayal looked perfect. The source had motive, access, and verification. There were no contradictions, no obvious gaps, and that made them confident, dangerously confident. They didn't question whether the list was complete because it felt too real to be manipulated. That was the fatal assumption. The Snitch believed he was selling Bumpy out. In reality, he was selling a snapshot frozen in time, stripped of context, and ready to be exploited. What he never considered was that the most important address on the list might already have stopped mattering long before he wrote it down. And while the Mafia celebrated the acquisition of knowledge, Bumpy Johnson was already preparing for what happens when your enemies think they finally know everything. Once the information reached the Mafia, it didn't sit in a drawer. It was dissected, cross-checked, and turned into something far more dangerous than a list, a working map of Bumpy Johnson's world. Each address was evaluated not just for what it was, but for what it represented. A house wasn't just a building, it was a signal. Who came and went, how often, at what hours. Patterns began to form, and patterns create confidence. What made the map so convincing was its internal consistency. The addresses aligned geographically. The timelines made sense. Some locations overlapped with known movements. Others filled gaps that had long frustrated Mafia surveillance. From their perspective, this wasn't scattered intelligence, it was a system revealing itself. And systems, once understood, can be dismantled. The Mafia believed they were seeing the full picture for the first time. Harlem no longer felt unpredictable. It felt charted, measured, controllable. With enough pins on the map, randomness disappears. Every potential escape route looks blocked. Every fallback looks exposed. The illusion of total coverage set in, and with it, a dangerous shift in mindset. They stopped asking what might be missing. What they failed to recognize was that maps don't show importance, only presence. A location can exist on paper while being operationally irrelevant. Bumpy Johnson understood this distinction better than anyone. He allowed certain addresses to remain visible precisely because visibility breeds complacency. If the enemy thinks they're watching everything, they stop imagining alternatives. As the Mafia finalized their plan, the map became the strategy. Crews were assigned. Timing was synchronized. Each address was treated as equally critical because the map suggested equal weight. It was a subtle but decisive mistake. When everything looks important, nothing stands out as the real center of gravity. Meanwhile, Bumpy wasn't scrambling to erase the map. He didn't need to. He knew the Mafia was now committed to it. The more effort they invested in validating those addresses, the harder it would be for them to question the foundation beneath their plan. Their confidence wasn't built on violence or numbers. It was built on the belief that information, once verified, stops changing. And that belief set the stage for what came next. Because while the Mafia was studying the map, Bumpy Johnson was quietly redefining what the map actually meant, shifting value, not locations, and letting his enemies prepare for a strike against a world that no longer existed. By the time the Mafia finished assembling their map, Bumpy Johnson already knew two things with absolute certainty. The betrayal was real, and the information being traded was mostly accurate. That combination mattered. If the list had been sloppy, he would have dismissed it. If it had been completely false, it would have raised suspicion. But a list that was almost perfect was far more dangerous and far more useful. Bumpy didn't react the way his enemies expected. He didn't burn houses, move loudly, or empty every location in a panic. Those moves signal fear, and fear invites pressure. Instead, he treated the map the same way a chess player treats a board that's been memorized by the opponent. You don't flip the board, you adjust one square and let them keep playing. Most of the addresses stayed active enough to look convincing. People still came and went, lights still turned on at night, cars still appeared at familiar hours. From the outside, nothing changed. That stability was intentional. It reassured the Mafia that their intelligence was holding, that the Snitch had delivered exactly what he promised. Confidence deepened, and confidence narrowed their vision. Then there was one house, the quiet pivot point. On paper, it looked critical. It had history, traffic, and just enough mystery to attract attention. But Bumpy stripped it of meaning without stripping it of appearance. No dramatic exit, no obvious cleanup. Just a gradual absence of what truly mattered. Money moved first, then conversations, then decisions. The building remained, but its role evaporated. This was the bait. The house wasn't meant to fool the Mafia visually. It was meant to anchor their assumptions. As long as that address sat in the center of their plan, everything else fell into place around it. They didn't need it to be full, they needed to believe it was. What made the move lethal was its simplicity. Bumpy didn't add false information. He let the Mafia add their own conclusions. They decided which houses mattered most. They chose the focal point. All he did was make sure the place they cared about no longer mattered to him. As preparations accelerated, Bumpy watched the rhythm of his enemies tighten. Once timing is locked, strategy becomes fragile. Change too much, and suspicion erupts. Change too little, and the trap closes. Bumpy changed exactly one thing, and when the Mafia finally moved, they would discover that they hadn't been chasing a ghost. They had been chasing something worse, a location that still existed, still looked right, and yet contained absolutely nothing they were looking for. When the Mafia finally moved, it happened exactly as planned. Crews rolled out in coordinated silence, each one assigned to an address that had already been rehearsed on paper a dozen times. Doors were hit almost simultaneously, minimizing warning and eliminating the chance of escape. From their perspective, this was execution, not improvisation. The map had done its job. Most locations delivered what they expected. People were present. Traces of activity were visible. Nothing felt off enough to raise alarms. That only reinforced the belief that the intelligence was solid. Then one crew reached the house that mattered most, the address that sat quietly at the center of the entire operation. Inside, there was nothing. No cash, no documents, no people, not even signs of a rushed exit. The house wasn't abandoned in panic. It had been emptied with intention. Furniture remained. Utilities were on. The place looked lived in, but it wasn't alive. And that detail changed everything. In organized crime, emptiness is louder than resistance. An empty house means foreknowledge. It means someone knew not just that an operation was coming, but when. The realization spread quickly. If the most important location was clean, then the plan itself had been anticipated. What they thought was a surprise was actually a response. The brilliance of Bumpy Johnson's move became clear in retrospect. He hadn't needed to protect every address, only the one the Mafia believed was central. By letting them succeed everywhere else, he prevented them from questioning the operation until it was already over. There was no dramatic failure, no shootout, no chaos, just a quiet confirmation that they had been led exactly where he wanted them. That single empty house poisoned the entire outcome. Every other find became irrelevant. Any leverage they thought they had evaporated instantly, because leverage depends on surprise. Once surprise is gone, information turns stale. Worse, the failure couldn't be openly discussed. Admitting the house was empty meant admitting they had been outmaneuvered intellectually, not overpowered, and that kind of defeat cuts deeper. It creates doubt about the snitch, about the map, about every piece of intelligence that followed. By the time the crews regrouped, the truth was unavoidable. The operation hadn't failed because of bad execution. It had failed because the most important address on the list had stopped mattering long before they ever knocked on the door. After the operation ended, there was no celebration, only silence. On paper, the Mafia had done everything right. The timing was precise. The information had checked out. Most of the addresses produced activity. Yet the outcome felt hollow because the one location that mattered had delivered nothing. And in that emptiness, doubt began to spread. The snitch became the problem. Not openly, not immediately, but subtly. His information hadn't been wrong, which made the failure harder to explain. If he had lied, the situation would have been simple. But he hadn't. That ambiguity stripped him of value. Intelligence that can't guarantee results is a liability, not an asset. From that moment on, every word he offered would be weighed against the memory of that empty house. For Bumpy Johnson, the aftermath was exactly what he wanted. He didn't retaliate. He didn't escalate. He didn't expose the betrayal publicly. Violence would have given the operation meaning. Silence erased it. By refusing to react, he let uncertainty do the damage for him. The Mafia's real loss wasn't money or territory, it was confidence. Once doubt enters an organization built on trust and secrecy, it spreads fast. Future plans would be questioned, sources would be reevaluated, maps would be second-guessed, and every delay created space for Bumpy to operate freely. The most dangerous part of the strategy was that it left no fingerprints. There was no moment they could point to and say, "This is where we lost." Just a growing awareness that someone had been thinking several steps ahead and that someone had chosen not to strike back. In the end, the betrayal achieved the opposite of what it was meant to do. It didn't expose Bumpy Johnson. It exposed the limits of information itself. Knowing every address didn't matter if you didn't know which one truly mattered. And that was the lesson Harlem understood long before the Mafia did. Power isn't about how much you know. It's about how much of what you know is actually true when it counts. In the end, this wasn't a story about a snitch or even about the Mafia. It was a story about how power really works when violence is taken off the table. Bumpy Johnson didn't survive because he was untouchable. He survived because he understood something most organizations learn too late. Information is only dangerous when it's believed without question. The Mafia had what they thought was total visibility: addresses, patterns, confirmation. And yet, one small assumption that the most important location on the map still mattered unraveled everything. Bumpy never needed to confront his enemies directly. He let them confront their own certainty instead. That single empty house wasn't just a tactical win. It was a psychological one. It planted doubt in their sources, hesitation in their planning, and fear in their confidence. From that moment on, every piece of intelligence carried a shadow. Every map looked incomplete, and that hesitation was worth more than any weapon. This is why Bumpy Johnson's name endured long after louder men disappeared. Not because he ruled through terror, but because he understood how to make others move exactly where he wanted them to go and arrive too late to matter. In Harlem, that lesson became legend. You could betray a man. You could sell his addresses. You could even surround him with certainty. But if he controlled what those addresses truly meant, you never really had him at all. And in a world built on secrets, the most powerful move isn't to hide the truth, it's to let your enemies believe they've already found it.